Let's continue our discussion on shares in a company. Hi, guys. Thank you so much for joining me. Just a few weeks ago, or maybe even last week, I'm starting to lose track of time. I talked a little bit about super voting rights in a company, and that came about because if you watch the news, WeWork has the co-working space startup has been in the news quite a bit because their CEO has been asked to step down, but yet the news is really largely about how he still controls ownership and controls what happens within that company because his shares carry super voting rights. Now, if you want to hear more about what those are and how they work, head on over to that video. You should be able to find it pretty easy in my channel. Today, I want to talk about something close to that topic, but I was asked the question by an entrepreneur. He wanted to understand if it's better or preferable to use a structure that would include preferred and common shares within a company, or structure your shares of the company such that they're A, B, and C shares in that company. So I want to talk a little bit further about that and explain what that means. So let's start with the concept of preferred and common shares. So when you have a startup, legally, you can form it with various classes of shares. And in this instance, with preferred and common shares, there's a difference between what those come with. Now, the easiest way to remember this is that common shares in a startup or in a business in general allow you to have voting rights when it comes time to vote on different motions that are happening within that company. So if you own any shares of a publicly traded company, most likely they are common shares. So for example, let's say you own shares of Apple, and Apple has a board meeting and they'll send you a proxy statement where you would, based on the number of shares you have, use your common share voting rights to vote for a new board of directors or some sort of new decision that that board is making. And the board would then vote based on, your proxy and the way in which you wish to vote. I have shares in many publicly traded companies, and that's what happens every time their board's going to be making a decision. They send me a notification that I can use my shares and my voting power to help steer the direction that that goes in. So that's common shares. Common shares equal voting rights. Now, preferred shares, often what a preferred share is it's coming with some sort of financial advantage. It might mean that if you have preferred shares in a company and they pay dividends, that only the preferred shareholders actually get that dividend. Or if they're doing some sort of distributions, only the preferred shareholders get those distributions. So the easiest way to think about the differences between those two, preferred and common shares, is that preferred comes with typically some sort of financial benefit, whereas common shares come with voting rights and they usually don't cross over. Now, what's the difference between when I talked about this idea of A, B, and C shares? Well, those are often all common shares, but the different class, A class of shares, B class of shares, C class of shares, they each come with different voting rights. And one example of that is what I talked about last week, which is this idea of super voting rights, or where one share carries more voting power. So here's an example using that. If you've invested in a company and they have just A and B type class of shares, maybe the A shares get 10 votes per share and the B class gets 5 votes per share. Okay. So with A, B, C, whatever level of shares, the class of shares that you have, what those are often doing is just differentiating the power of those shares when it comes time to vote on a motion or a decision that's being made. So let's go through it one more quick time. Preferred shares equals some sort of financial benefit, maybe dividends, distributions. Common shares equals voting rights. And within common shares, you often have these A, B, and C class of shares and onward sometimes, to where you are having more voting power depending on the class of shares you have. So now back to the question I was asked, is it better to go the route of having preferred and common shares, or just issuing all common shares but with class A and class B? Well, guess what? I'm going to give you my legal answer. The answer is it really depends. And what it really comes down to is two things. First of all, when you structure a company, the thing you should always be asking yourself, regardless of what share structure you use, but also because of what share structure you use, which structure is going to be more appealing to an investor? That's what you've got to ask yourself. The investors that you want to target, which structure is more appealing to them? Now, with common shares, if you have A and B shares, and you're only allowing the founders to get A shares, and those A shares carry more votes than the B shares, and the investors can only have the B shares, then the investors are not going to be as attracted to that because you could theoretically always have more voting power than they do, just like in the WeWork example. So when you're building your structure of your company and the equity that's involved with it, be sure you structure that intelligently so it makes your business more attractive to investors. Now, the second part of that decision really does come down to what you want. I mean, if it's your intention that you want to have as a founder, you want to have the ability for only founders to have one class of shares and every other investor to have another class of shares, then you're going to want to structure it that way. If you want to have where the founders have common shares, but the investors get preferred shares, that way they get paid back sooner through some financial benefits, then structure it that way. So it just comes down to understanding the differences between how you can do these things and also making deliberate decisions based on how you think an investor would be attracted to your business and what they would be looking for. But the biggest thing I want to leave you with today is to not get too complicated with your equity structure. It can get out of hand a lot of times where you have these ridiculous equity structures. It just gets too complicated. That's more legal cost for you to consume. It's more complicated to manage the business when it comes down to that. So avoid this idea of getting overly complicated with the structure of your company, with how you structure the shares within your company, because you've got better things to be focusing on than whether you're going to have A through Z shares and who owns them and what those voting rights are and how many of them they get. I hope that makes sense. Talk to you later. See ya.